Hello and welcome to the WPA OG podcast. This episode features an interview with Carl Owens, West Point class of 1978, and Kafi Joseph, West Point class of 2003. Carl has over 30 years of experience as a proven Army leader with extensive management and hands-on experience gained by serving in numerous critical acquisition positions that provided direct support to the Warfighters. He has served as a leader of diverse groups of functional civilian, military, and contractor personnel. Kafi is currently the Chief of Staff for Metro DC at Accenture. Previously, she led sports, military, manufacturing, and strategy teams in 4 different countries. She's an Army veteran, certified project management professional, an M.B.A. graduate from Georgetown University, and an M.S. graduate in systems engineering from George Washington University. In this episode, Carl and Kafi talk about the changes in diversity over time at the Academy, the importance of cultivating community through clubs and programs, and the strong legacies they left behind at West Point. Now, please enjoy this interview between Carl Owens, West Point class of 1978, Kafi Joseph, West Point class of 2003, and your host, Michonne Wilson, Global Business Strategy and Operations Lead, Go-to-Market at Google, and West Point grad, class of 2011.
Good afternoon. We're here on the West Point AOG podcast. I'm your host today, Michonne Wilson. I'm a 2011 grad. I'm privileged here to have 2 guests join me. One, Mr. Carl Owens. He's a class of 1978. And then also Ms. Kafi Joseph, class 2003. What we'll do here today is we're going to discuss a couple interesting topics. One, specifically focusing on Do More Together and their impact as an organization, but also looking at the importance of racial equity and inclusion from where the Academy was in the 70s to where we are now and kind of how things have changed. And so my 2 guests here, they'll talk a little bit about their backgrounds, provide a little more insight as to their journey at the Academy and in the military. And then we'll kind of dive into some interesting topics from there. And so without further delay, let me turn it over to Mr. Carl Owens to give a brief introduction about himself, kind of where he's coming from, his background, and kind of his influence at the Academy.
My name is Carl Owens. I'm a retired colonel. I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama. My father was an E6 in the Air Force, and my mother was a domestic worker who eventually became a nurse. I grew up during the Civil Rights Movement. Primarily, my entry to an academy was in the summer of 1974. And my experiences that I brought to the academy were basically influenced by growing up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama. Primarily, my grandparents were the grandchildren of slaves. My influence was primarily based on their work ethic and the impact of watching segregation as I grew up and understanding the transition to where we are now in an environment that's significantly different from when I entered the academy.
Hi there, I'm Kafi Joseph. I am a 2003 graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. I am originally from San Fernando, Trinidad and Tobago, so I'm a first-generation immigrant. And when we moved and immigrated to the U.S., I grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland. So first-gen immigrant, was raised primarily by my mother, obviously know both my parents. And then later on, when my mother got married, she was married to a retired Navy SEAL. So a little bit of that influence in the beginning parts of my military career. I did 5 years on active duty in the Army as a military police officer, and then transitioned into the National Guard, served for another 4 years while working in consulting. I've served in a variety of industries. So transitioned first into consulting, then I worked in logistics overseas in Dubai, came back to the US, did my first master's at George Washington University in systems engineering, did my second at Georgetown, got my M.B.A. from there, all of those while working. And then I also worked in manufacturing as a director of program management for a company that engineered engines for Navy ships and power plants. And then I'm now back in consulting at Accenture more so on the people side. I have a new role. So I worked in inclusion and diversity, standing up our client-facing inclusion and diversity practice. I helped to stand up our CEO advisory practice. And then I've just recently transitioned. I'm the Metro DC market lead and chief of staff for our office managing director for Washington, DC. So that's our region spanning from Baltimore all the way down to Richmond for Accenture.
Very robust career. Quick background on myself. Again, Mason was in class 2011, originally a native of San Francisco Bay Area before I came to the Academy to study econ with a minor in systems engineering. Spent some time in the 173rd, left as a captain to get my M.B.A. at Duke, spent a couple years as management consultant at Parthenon, and then pivoted into technology where I've worked at Apple and currently work in strategy and operations at Google. And so with kind of where we are now, I'd like to start by focusing on the climates in which we came to the Academy and how that kind of shaped our experience. And so, Mr. Owens, I know you mentioned quickly that, you were kind of a product of the civil rights era. And so can you talk about how that influenced your Academy experience versus Kafi, you coming in the midst of the global war on terror?
So to put it in perspective, I graduated from high school in 1974. Until I went to high school in 1970, I had grown up in all segregated environment, with the exception of my dad's tour in Japan, where my mom and I traveled to Japan when I was 18 months old on a 30-day cruise ship. And it was my mom's first time away from Alabama. And throughout that experience, she was always remembering about that trip, years later. She would always talk about having traveled to Japan in the 4 years she spent in Japan, and my parents stayed in touch with a lot of friends, and that environment was integrated. We lived in an apartment complex, and that was right after, around 1950s, after Truman had integrated the military. And my father was actually drafted into a segregated army, but shortly after he got to Korea for his combat tour, they integrated the service. So you can see my background was having parents who had grown up in a segregated environment, who had learned and had those experiences of being in an integrated environment. But we returned back to Alabama in the 1960s and was thrust back into that segregated environment. And throughout that experience, my parents always influenced us to treat people the way we wanted to be treated. And the golden rule was primarily the guiding point for my life and my experiences that transitioned to when I got to West Point. So West Point was my first time away from home since my travels to Japan. That was almost 20 years prior. It was quite an experience being at West Point. Everybody knows how Beast is when you get to Beast. That first day, you get all your bags and they throw you in a room. Like all new cadets, I was experiencing the anxiety of not only being in away from home, but being thrust into West Point and all its Beast Barracks traditions. My parents told me when I left, it was my choice to go to West Point, and if I chose to do otherwise, then they still loved me. About 2 weeks into my experience at West Point, I became homesick. And fortunately enough for me, the first Black graduate from the state of Alabama lived in my neighborhood, was class of 75, a guy named James Ben. And James Ben was a Beast company commander during that time frame. And it just so happened my squad leader was a good friend of James. And I told my squad leader at the end of that second week that I was thinking about going home. And he offered me the opportunity to talk to James because he knew we were both from Birmingham. James came to see me. We talked. He said, which is unusual, he said, what if I gave you the opportunity to talk to your dad about whether or not you want to stay at the academy or not? And I said, that would be great. I talked to my dad. We came to the conclusion that, I was just homesick and that I really wanted to be at the academy. And that was the last time I had any doubt as to whether or not I wanted to be a cadet. Here it is, almost 45 years later. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd do it all over again.
Very impactful story.
Yeah, Carl, I was laughing a little bit at a couple of contrasts for Beast Barrack and for our parents. So before I jump into it, as I mentioned, my mom's a first-gen immigrant. When I said that I wanted to go to West Point, she was like, I am not signing that. I want no parts of the military. I don't understand why you want to do this. I was 17 when I entered the academy. She's like, I'm not signing this. It's not happening. And my grandfather back in Trinidad, although he did not travel a lot, was very well read. He had this library. He had all these magazines that he would get shipped to his Sky mailbox. He, knew all of the things before, we really even had access to the internet and all of that. He just read and read and read. And he talked to my mother and was like, Beverly, you immigrated, you uprooted your life. You said that you wanted to go here so your daughter could have the best education, the best opportunity. This is that. You better sign those papers. So it was just really interesting. So that piece, and then you mentioned Beast Barracks. I don't know, it's probably like 10 seconds for y'all, Carl, but you get that 90 seconds to say goodbye to your parents. My mom in that moment was like, I wish I had raised you to be so independent because I only took 10 seconds. I was like, all right, bye, I'm out. And grabbed my bag and walked across the field to the other side of the stadium.
I hate to be the old grad, but in our case, we didn't get 90 seconds. The parents weren't even allowed in the area when I was a cadet. That started probably about 10 years after I graduated or so, because I remember the first time I saw a picture of folks sitting in the auditorium talking to their parents. For us, the minute you got off that bus from New York or wherever you came, there was that man in the red sash, and that was it. Things changed, don't they?
They do. And they had the auditorium. We had the stadium.
I had the auditorium.
Yeah.
I said my goodbyes in California. I was like, we're just going to go to college. I'll see y'all, pre-parent weekend or whatever. It's good.
Yeah. I mean, we lived in Maryland, so it was an easy drive up for us. So I actually also went with my high school best friend, and he showed up with a grocery bag. Was his bag. I had like a little shoulder bag of stuff. I started giving my mom stuff. I was like, please mail this to me later. I don't need any of this if that's all Kali has. So
the transition for me was so great because growing up in Birmingham, I could walk and pass the jail that Martin Luther King was jailed in. I can remember as a kid watching the news and seeing all the places that we were frequenting where riots were taking place. I can remember the kids exiting because I was about third grade in 1965 when we were getting ready for the Voting Rights Act, and Birmingham was really hot at that time. All of those things I can remember pretty vividly, and most salient was the fact that one of my classmates lost her first cousin in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And that was pretty impactful for our community because those four girls had extended relationships and their families had extended relationships. And in the community, there were parents who were teachers. Like I said, that we had students who lost loved ones. It was pretty impactful. And to think 10 years later, I'm sitting at West Point, a premier institute in America, having left such a troubled, segregated environment. So there is progress, and I'm a product of that progress.
And we're a product of your progress, sir.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of commonalities between our experiences, but also a lot of stark differences. Kafi, could you share kind of your experience in coming to the academy, a pre-9/11 era, and what does that look like? And I guess how that changed while you were at the academy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I graduated from high school, and it sounds so a lot far away for me sometimes, in 1999. And that's when I entered the academy, June 28th, 1999. And obviously this was a pre-9/11. 9/11 happened my cow year. It happened, a few weeks after our affirmation ceremony. At the time that we entered the academy and we went through Buckner, it was, Grenada was, I think, the biggest, mustard stain conflict for people. Kosovo, was the conflict, but we were really talking about and hearing about getting to the Army, training well and being prepared. And then 9/11 happens, our cow year, our squad leaders and our firsties, are heading out and graduating and going, to war. And then the shock and awe and invasion into Baghdad happened on spring break, my first year. So it's like Cal year, we affirmed. It's like, all right, this is real. How does this change? I remember our PL 1100 courses changing. The tone and the tenor of everything was, you are going into a different army. You're going into an army that's in conflict, that's at war. And so just pivoting for that. And then if it wasn't really clear with 9/11 happening and being so close to us, right? Like watching that happen as we were like entering class as cadets, to have shock and awe happen and that invasion happen while we're firsties on spring break, it was definitely clear, if it wasn't readily apparent to us, that that's the kind of army that we were going to go into. So graduated. I was a military police officer. I went, actually, though, not straight into combat. I went to Korea because when we were picking our duty stations and thinking about, what's happening, for me, that was the best places at MP to go. Lots of training, lots of engagement, and apparently not the units that are going to deploy right away, because there's a mission at that time and places that we had to do and where we had to be posted in Korea. So I went to Korea as a lieutenant. I came back stateside, was actually in the old guard. So again, I kept waiting for the real army. Everywhere I went, it was like, Korea's not the real army. The old guard's not the real army. And when I finally deployed, I deployed in June of 2007 to Baghdad. And it was actually as an IMA. So I deployed strat ops protection, force protection, essentially looking at how we're protecting and securing the bases all across the theater of operations in Iraq. So it was very different and interesting for me. But coming into, that space and that climate, being deployed, being downrange was not what our Buckner was like. When I hear about how cadets now, maybe even you, Meshan, when you trained, it was very much for the mission at hand. What we were training for were the types of missions that the Army had before. So it's really interesting and keen to see. When I went back to the academy, I worked in admissions and heard about their summer training, like to see how quickly the academy pivoted and was ensuring that, our cadets are actually training for what they're rolling into versus, the past. So it was rattling though, and it was scary and it was different. I imagine and I would ask you, Meshan, for you at that point, we had been at war, in conflict, the Gulf War on Terror is happening for, years. And so you knew what you were rolling into. But for us, it was very, very new and very, very different. We knew it was a possibility, but it was never like apparent or imminent. And so it definitely was just surreal for us in that moment as cadets to realize, like, yeah, we're leading America's sons and daughters, and we're going to be leading them in conflict downrange in some very difficult situations. So,
yeah, I find that experience somewhat similar to my experience. Really, it was just the opposite. I grew up in the midst of the Vietnam War, and at the end of, we had all the expectations that we were going to Vietnam. We thought at the end of that 4 years, the war might still be going on, even though it was winding down. There was that possibility. And I can remember at the end of plebe year, we actually saw the evacuation. Everybody saw the evacuation from Vietnam and how chaotic it was. The entire army was geared toward deployment and another war similar to the Vietnam War. It was probably 10 years later, by the time I got to Command General Staff, that we had actually significantly changed our tactics to be not so focused on a war similar to Vietnam, but to a war that might be with defending against the Soviet Union. All our instructors throughout my time at the academy, we had an awful lot of opportunity to hear from the staff and faculty about their experience. Just about every instructor had been to Vietnam. Some had been there on multiple tours. We were ingrained and focused on what was going to be that next step and prepared to go to war. But most of us didn't go to war until Desert Storm. And that was quite a different war from what Vietnam had been. It's interesting how the Academy introduces us early on to what we expect the next war to be, but in reality, it may be something very different by the time we graduate.
Yeah, very much so. I came in a time we were in the midst of that transition. So we'd been at war in Afghanistan for 6, almost 7 years. And so most of my instructors were classes of the late 90s. And so they served as, staff officers or commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it was clear as day, like, you're going somewhere, either Afghanistan, Iraq. And I remember, like, even though we went through the RBAC, we were talking about the rifle bayonet assault course. Every conversation was about how do you lead patrols, how do you respond to IEDs, kind of dealing with a lot of those relevant skills. And I think for me as a third generation veteran, it kind of hit differently. And so I remember listening to stories as a kid in the 90s, late 80s of my grandparents in the Second World War. And so I felt like 9/11 was my Pearl Harbor moment. And so that was kind of the back of my mind coming to the academy. And then as my classmates graduated, people were looking at the patch charts to the deployment rotations to see which units were the first thing out the door. So when they graduated, they were ready and getting after it as best they could. So it's interesting to see those themes across different years and classes.
The year before you graduated, Mashawn, I was the board selected PM as a civilian for the MRAP program. And I lived in Detroit for 4 years. I spent a lot of it deployed putting MRAPs into Afghanistan. And it was the most rewarding thing I'd done in my career, both in military and as civilian, to be part of something that occurred in less than 18 months. We were able to deploy vehicles and save a lot of lives. Not only was it Army, but the mere fact that it was had joint missions, I learned a great deal from my Marine counterparts and even our Air Force folks who are engaged. And it turns out, this is how West Point is: large but small. So I've been on the program it was a joint program, and the headquarters was at the Marine headquarters at Quantico. I was in Detroit, and I'd come to meetings. And I'm about 2 years into being a PM when I'm sitting in a meeting, and I have one of my West Point shirts on. Just so happened that the counterpart to me was a West Point grad. Not only was he a West Point grad, but he was my classmate. And we had not known each other when we were at the academy. So the world can be both large and small.
And so in talking about how large and small the world is, you give us a context for the time that you entered the academy and what that looked like. What did the population of minorities or Black West Pointers look like when you were at the academy? How big or small was it?
I think I can illustrate that pretty quickly. The first graduate of West Point is class of 1877, Henry Flipper. The fourth Black graduate of West Point is B.O. Davis Jr. in 1936. By the time we get to the early 70s, the classes have been really small, and less than 100 West Pointers, Black West Pointers, have graduated. Less than 100 by early 1970s. The class before me was probably the largest class. That class was roughly about 80. And then the class of 78 was roughly about 100 minority cadets. So you can see by the time I get there in 1974, and the class of 77 and 78, almost double the total number of total graduates since 1877. So that tells you how quickly things change. But, I have to keep in mind that the academy itself had doubled in size. It used to be 2 regiments. It had ballooned in the 60s to 4 regiments. But even then, it kind of blows your mind that almost 100 years, you graduated less than the 2 classes that ended in 1973 and 1974.
Yeah, it's amazing to see, like you said, that growth. And then I remember, I don't know the stats, Carl, like you do, for my class off the top of my head for all of the minorities in my class or all of the Black people. But I do know that my class had, we came in at 23 Black women. We graduated 19. I'm the nerdy person that keeps a list. I have a list. I'm like, who are the WPBG03? All right, this is who we have. So I know that we graduated 19, and I remember seeing on TikTok when the class of, I think it was 2021 that had the highest number of Black women to graduate in recent history. And to see that 2021, it's not quite 20 years later, we went from 23 to 40. It was cool. And I understand that our demos have to, we want them ideally to mirror the Army and all of those things. And it also felt like not enough. And I kept that to myself, but I remember just being like, but that's it, really? In 20 years, it's like essentially one Black woman per year. And then I remember also when I was a cadet, there was an 80-something grad. I can't remember her year group, but we're at a football game, we're rocking the black and gold, we're running. She's like, how many Black women are in your class? She's all excited to hear the numbers. And I'm like, we have 23, or, how many ever we had at the time. And she kind of felt like, I saw it on her face, like how I felt at that time, which I think they maybe had 10 or maybe 15 in their class, to not have seen the numbers increased incrementally in, again, similar another 20 years later. So I know the Academy is doing well, and I know across the board, what we hear from admissions, that the numbers have increased and the quality of grads, and what they're accomplishing, our minority and our Black grads are accomplishing, has increased. And it's amazing to see. And we know that we can still do more. So those are the numbers for our classmates. And I feel like when I look at the firsties who are ahead of us, like, we were a big class of Black women. Our class of Black women are still very tight. We vacation together every 2 years. We're going somewhere international. We just came back from Aruba in February. I've heard from classes behind ours that they looked up to us because we were pretty close. But the classes of like 2000 maybe had like 5 or 6 Black women, and the class of 2001 the same. 2002 maybe double that. So it's just really interesting to see that the numbers have increased. And I always feel like we can still do more. We can have more. So felt like there are a lot more Black male classmates, like in the hundreds, a couple, not a couple hundred, but like probably the low hundreds. But I don't know those stats. And then as far as just diversity overall, I do remember that there's a joke about the 5th Reg. So obviously there were 4 regiments where we were cadets. There's a 5th regiment that's the Black cadets. And apparently the Asian cadets got in on it. So 1st Battalion's the Black cadets and 2nd Battalion's the Asian cadets. So, I do remember and feeling like, hey, yes, of course, overwhelmingly the Academy is predominantly white. However, feeling like we had pockets and groups within our different groups. There's also a vibrant Latino community when I was there with classes, engaging, and then the different clubs and groups that we had. So obviously we're not in an HBCU. We obviously weren't at a historical, Hispanic serving institution. However, I felt like the communities that we had, there were enough of us to have that community. It wasn't like, oh, I'm the 1 or the 2 or, a handful. So that I feel like is different than the classes. Definitely, obviously, the classes before us having smaller numbers.
So I'm old, but I'm not old enough to have known Henry Flipper as the first Black cadet, but I do know the 2 first female cadets. I was a cow when we integrated women into the Academy in the summer of '76. There was a big project called Project Athena prior to that. So I can remember them doing the drills. Some of us participated in preparing beasts to have introduced women. The other part was when the first women came on board, there weren't enough to have in every company. So essentially everybody was women, and there might be 3 women because they tried to keep it so that women had roommates, and some of the floors were isolated. But I can remember there being, for me, it was kind of seamless. I really didn't think a whole lot about it because I saw women being welcomed into the Corps. But I'm sure that women faced a lot of adversity in those years in 1976. Later on, I served with Joy Dallas, who's the 2nd Black female to graduate, Pat Locke. Pat was the first Black female to graduate, and she was on the one of the rabble rousers at the Corps Squad. And just so happened, one of my roommates was, by the time she graduated, when we were firsties, one of my roommates was interested in her. So I knew her from that perspective. But, everybody in the gospel choir, we had no problems having women in the gospel choir. We needed some sopranos because we had too many bass in that group.
Yeah, we had cast when we were cadets. We had cast jams. So I DJ'd at the radio station because that was the best way I could get access to music as a plebe without breaking any regs. So I would DJ for cash jams. And then we had NSBE, so the National Society of Black Engineers. And I don't know if they called it that when you were, they called them NSBE cues when you were.
Actually, NSBE wasn't at the academy when I was there. When I went to grad school, I majored in engineering at the University of Central Florida. And I joined NSBE as a captain. I didn't know NSBE existed when I was a cadet. I found out later on after graduation and working with other engineers that it was an organization. I'm glad to see the academy integrated that into the program also. I've been contributing toward those as special donations probably for about 15 years or more, primarily because the academy allows you to do designated donations. I designate to the gospel choir, the contemporary affairs seminar, and another program that I highly recommend is the one that brings youth to the academy.
SLE, Summer Leaders Experience.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely valuable program, primarily because not only do you get to see the academy, but it sends kids back out to their schools to talk to friends about the academy. One thing I didn't talk about was I didn't go to the academy alone. Primarily, my neighbor decided to go to West Point. Now, he was being recruited for basketball, but he was an outstanding student, was Boys State, which is one of the highest honors you can get for both academic and leadership skills. When he found out that I was interested in going to West Point, the two of us made a pact that we go there together, which we fulfill. Both of us went there. We fly into New York and stay at what was called the Barbizon Plaza, located on Park Avenue. We get off the bus at the academy, and that's the last time we see each other for the next 6 weeks until Beast is over. And so, anyway, he decided that he had this longtime girlfriend. He decided he was homesick, and unlike me, he actually went through and decided to leave the academy and went back and completed his degree at University of Alabama, electrical engineering, did outstanding, was an executive in Alabama Power, and now he's a minister in our hometown. But it's important that people share these type of stories because it was the mere fact that two of us had an experience and a common desire that we both got each other interested in going to the academy. And I think these summer programs also produce that type of energy where somebody might not be aware that's fully capable of meeting the academic rigor, meeting West Point standards. They just don't have the knowledge in their community.
That's a good point, Mr. Owens. I think a lot of those programs, not only they're funded by academy graduates through the March of Excellence program, but also they help kind of feed into that broader network of people that go out and do great things once they leave the academy. I've seen several of those while I was a cadet. I know we have one of the most diverse extracurricular programs in the nation, everything from skydiving to sailing. Then similar to Kafi, was very involved in NSBE, CAS, and a couple other clubs specifically around my fellow minority cadets that kind of built my own sense of community.
To build on to that, I visited West Point in high school, but when we bring in students who are applying, minority students who are most likely going to get accepted, or, we bring them in for that weekend when they're in high school and they get paired up with a plebe. I did that in high school. I did that with my best friend who also went into the academy with me. I should shout him out, Kali Johnson Brock, class of 03. We did both graduate together, but that was also important. So we flew in, we did that. My experience, I was thinking about, I'll admit this now because I made the right choice, but I was thinking about going to the Naval Academy. I grew up in Maryland. It's here.
I was going to the Air Force Academy until my buddy said we both need to go to West Point.
Yeah, and it was closer. I knew about it. It was more readily accessible to me, in my experience and what I was exposed to. I was going to be a Marine Corps officer, all those things. I had it figured out because I was in junior ROTC and all of that. But so we both were. So we went to visit West Point, though, and staying with the plebes that we stayed with, seeing other Black women, seeing them interact, seeing their community and the close-knitness. I got to see the gospel choir, before, although I did not join because I cannot hold a note, y'all. But
That wasn't a criteria when I was a cadet.
They sing good.
and,
No, but
they were treating you guys like the Glee Club, because when I was cadet, there were only like 3 kids who were from the Glee Club who come sing with the gospel choir, and they carry all the other songs, and all we do is hum in the background.
but being able to visit the academy and to see that was instrumental for me, because I did the Naval Academy summer seminar and I did my West Point visit, but seeing that community and then, having the cadets that I stayed with, like, just share, their experiences and everything else, that was critical for me. And I think the other part is having talked to some Black women who, again, because I was in junior ROTC, a lot of people in my circles went to the academies. Some of the Black women who went to the Naval Academy, what they described as their midshipman experience was not what I saw and heard from the West Point women who were there ahead of me. They did not have that close-knitness. Their community was not the same. It was very different. And that's not a knock on the Naval Academy or anything like that, but that's just what it was. And so it was that visit, and having the ability to visit and to actually be around cadets and be immersed in it and see it firsthand was key for me as well, and making sure, I chose to go where I did. So,
yeah, I came as a rising senior to SLE, and then had a really good outreach officer and had the privilege to come back and be one myself. And so I think a lot of those programs really provide a good window, because all they talked about on the West Coast was maybe Naval Academy and Air Force. And so seeing just the type of people that come to West Point, the type of drive, the type of community, and the type of friends I still have to this day, where at a moment's notice, I'll dip set to halfway around the world in a moment's notice, is something I'll forever treasure. And so talking about that, we talked about a little bit how the lasting impact that you had at the academy, what the community looked like. What is like your lasting legacy when you look back over your academy career or your military career? What's something that you're like, I'm known for this, or I'm remembered because of this? Whether it's a club, an initiative, it could be any of those things.
One of the things that I learned at the academy, West Point was a great place for me to understand leadership and to learn about diversity. Having grown up in an environment in which integration was very new, and I say that's only 10 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. One of the things I learned was that, for the most part, people are people. And it helps. It helps to see people who look like you and understand where you come from, because there was a whole, and when I say that, I mean from a regional point of view, because I was a Southerner coming into an environment in which there were people from all kinds, from the Northeast and from the West, and trying to just navigate that diversity, and then navigating racial diversity. All of those things helped me develop and learn and develop relationships based on how I click with people. Whether you have friends, and I'm sure you had that when you were at the academy, that transition, their outward appearance. It's not about outward appearance, it's that feeling that you get being around them. And, I developed some very close relationships, both Black and white. But what I did learn once I left the academy was taking all those leadership lessons to the infantry officer basic course, understanding how to relate to folks, and then working with a bigger pot of people who come from ROTC, HBCUs, big universities, just understanding that the most important thing that you learn is how to communicate and interact with people, and to be brave enough to start up a conversation with people that you don't know, and what you do find out is you're far more alike than you are different. And that was the most important. I would have never learned that. I would have learned that, but I didn't have that opportunity to learn that early on, because I was growing up. Even in high school, it was a little different in high school, because I did get bussed into integrating a white high school in Birmingham as part of the forced integration movement after the federal courts had intervened, because Brown versus Board of Education occurred in the 1950s. in the South, integration didn't get enforced until the late 60s and early 70s. So you can see there was an awful lot of transition going on. But most important thing I learned from my experience at West Point was how to communicate and how to interact with people who are like and different from me.
For me, 100%, it's Women's Army Rugby, right? It's having founded, being the first team captain just this past November, planning and celebrating our first ever celebration of 20 years of the women's rugby team is huge. At the time that we were establishing the team and starting the team, we were not thinking about a legacy. We were not thinking about the impact. We were just thinking about wanting to play a sport and wondering how the heck the Academy doesn't have one. Navy and Air Force has one. How come we don't have a women's team? And then being able to participate. So when we, like I said, in November, by the chance of the universe, our anniversary celebration was literally to the day 20 years of when the Commandant, General Brooks, granted us team statehood. When we were planning, people were pulling things out from their hard drives, everything else. And someone actually found the email where he said, all right, you all are good, start making it happen. So when we planned our anniversary weekend for women's rugby, the first night, first of all, we had, how am I getting emotional, y'all? And it only happens when I'm on camera or something. But we had an exhibit at the West Point Museum. So for the whole first semester of the year, up until December of 2022, there was an exhibit on Women's Army Rugby, which is insane to think, we're just now hitting our 20-year graduation anniversary, or our reunion's coming up, 20 years of the team, and we've got an exhibit for the rugby team. So our first event was planned around that exhibit. The exhibit had pictures of the first team, had jerseys, had tickets from when they first won the national championship, which was only in 2011. So just under, 10 years of being founded. It had Olympian jerseys. We have rugby players who are Olympians that came from the Academy. And so that to me was amazing to see. And people will tell me like, this is your legacy. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And it is though, right? Have to own that. Around our programming, the very first night, we held a welcome reception in the museum so that everyone could see that exhibit. And then for Carl, we call Women's Army Rugby War, and the players are warriors, which is actually pretty dope now because we have some people who no longer identify necessarily as women. And so to be able to just call them warriors and not have to worry about, misgendering someone is pretty cool. But that first night, we had a session where we called it War Stories. And so we just asked everyone who was there, once we had the sessions, the refreshments, and the current cadets came through. There were recruits, y'all. We have recruits now. Like women's rugby is now a D1 sport, and they had candidates who were being recruited. So after we did all of that, we just sat around and shared stories, like your favorite experience, your best experience about the women's rugby team. And what I did not expect or anticipate was to hear from women for whom the team was a light, grace, and saving force, because we also, while I myself am a straight woman, I am an ally to the Pride community. And there were a fair amount of women on the team who were suffering under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, figuring out what to do. They were at odds with how they were living a lie and how that was at odds also with the honor code and what to do. And this team provided community for that group. So that was very interesting. And I didn't even know or didn't even think about what this team would be doing. And that's what it did. Another thing that was pretty cool for me when I was back at the Academy and working in admissions is I'm sitting around, maybe some of your classmates or a year after you, they're like, yeah, ma'am, if you're a Black girl at West Point, you either run track, play ball, or play rugby. And I was like, what? How? That's pretty dope. I don't know if that's necessarily the same now, but in 2008, 2007, 8, that was true. And I think that's also because of who started the team. When you try to do something, you start something, you bring your friends into it. A lot of my girlfriends who were classmates that were Black women that were on that team, there were like 10 Black women on the team. And they're like, I'm only doing this because you're doing this. It's important to you. We want to do this, but I support you. And, you're my sister. And so I'm going to do that. And so similarly to Cass and Nesby and everything else, when you see community, you see people who look like you have a place to go. And so for the people who are like, I can't sing, or I didn't come in a track star, the rugby team at that time was, if you're an athlete, which every cadet is, if you have some tenacity, you can come here. Nobody has ever played rugby before, so you can learn it and you can excel. And so that was a space and a home for them. And so all of that has been interesting. And then when I got to hearing that at the 20-year anniversary was amazing, to like things that I couldn't even fathom that the team did for women and for the rugby players and the Warriors. That was awesome. And then I also just got to witness firsthand. I was back at the academy as an outreach officer. They do mass athletics. Of course, I'm going to be an OIC coach, whatever you need for the rugby team, because I'm here. And I'm standing up on the steps, like pretending like I'm a sport that's supposed to be there. What are you doing? Come over here. Join the rugby team. Run down. I got to see the class of 2011. They were my plebes. I got to see them mature throughout their time at the academy, go out into the Army, and to see their sisterhood. The thing that I didn't have was, we started the team when I was at the end of my Cal years, when we started working towards forming it, and then my first year. So my friendships that I had at the academy were forged before we started the team. The rest of these women, when I talked to them, they just expressed to me how much that team is their family, their sisterhood. Any team or club that you've been on that's done that, that team is it. And so it's really amazing for me to hear that, to see that. It's surreal, because I still feel like I'm a young grad, for someone to say that that's your legacy or that's the contribution. And it's beautiful for me and the founding 40, that, that's something that we've left for the academy, and for it to mean so much for so many different communities of women or the people who are on the team. It's great. If there's nothing else that happens, that's an accomplishment that I'm very proud of and happy to contribute to the academy.
Kafi, you are a young grad. I'm going to my 45th reunion in October, so.
I'll see you there. I'll be there for my 20 year.
So you are young. I can remember being a plebe, and we'd be standing there, and it's getting close to June week, and these people from the 50s would come, and I look at those guys and said, man, those guys are ancient, man. What are these? Oh, that really meant old grad to me. And then I looked at my picture from our 30th reunion, and we were all the old bald head guys that look like the same guys that they're in the 50s. So it'll happen to you too.
Hopefully not the hair part, though.
No, not the hair part. Not the hair part.
Oh, great accomplishments. I think for me, looking back, it's probably on the respect committee. I was on the brigade respect committee, and it showed me how challenging, rewarding DEI and EEO can be in a predominantly white setting, whether that's at the academy or in corporate life and the past few corporations I've been a part of. It helped reinforce what the important pieces of change are and how important both allyship and sponsorship looks in that process. And so, similar to Kathy's earlier point, even as a straight male, I helped with the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy my first year when I was on the Brigade Respect Committee. And so just the amount of opportunities that I've had at the academy and military life to cause an impact far greater than myself, I'll really treasure those. And the fact that even though I've been at outreach for several years, I still get the random cold calls of people wondering what they should do with their life next. And I really enjoy that ability to reach back and mentor. And so we've talked about a lot of great things. You guys have given some amazing advice, both about joining the academy during times of strife, during various conflicts. Are there any other parting words of wisdom that you would give to young grads, particularly Black grads, that might be helpful both in shaping their military career for success, but also when they decide to transition, any words that can help follow them throughout their lives and careers?
So I'll chime in on this one, primarily because I got words of wisdom a long time ago from when I was a cadet, because, I say the transition was hard. Sometimes going to AI and doing all the things to make sure I graduated from the academy, and you leave high school, on a high because I was at the top of my class doing all these things, and all of a sudden I get to the academy, and it's like a culture. It's like somebody threw cold water on you. one of the things that people told me and encouraged me to remember that this 4 years is a training ground. You're going to get a great education. You're gonna do all the things that you need to do to prepare yourself to be an officer. But the key is you're gonna graduate in 4 years or 5 years, but one day you're gonna be an officer, whether that's for 5 years or 30 years, like me. And what you have to realize is your life is not gonna end or be accelerated based on what you did at academy in the past. The day you put on that second lieutenant bar, you stepped into a new arena, and you should be using every lesson that you learned to excel as an officer, because that's the 30-year part or the 5-year part. The 4-year part of West Point is important, but remember, you're being blessed at graduation with a new day to make sure you're the best that you can be for the next 5 or 30 years or whatever career path you decide. So a lot of cadets really get mired and can't. I've seen it over and over. I served as an assignments officer as a major at HRC. Too often, cadets get mired in this perspective. Either they excelled or they failed, or they just made it and and they're still buried in that thought process about what occurred at West Point. The day you become a second lieutenant, you need to be doing whatever it takes to be the best officer or the best human being you're going to be for the rest of your life.
That resonates, to not get stuck on what happened when you were a cadet, that you graduate and everyone is a lieutenant, for sure. I will take it beyond the Army, so I will build on that. So for folks who decide not to make a career out of the Army, I think there's two pieces of advice that I would share, and it's from lessons learned for myself. So the first one is, we have a built-in network, use it. I think there is some hesitancy sometimes around using the network, around leveraging it, about reaching out or cold calling. Use that network, connect with people that you have in your class, connect with people that you have met. Literally every single role that I have had since I left the Army, I have never applied for the job. It has been through my West Point network, because we know while our experiences are different, we know the core and the crux of the people who come to the academy, who stay at the academy, who graduate from the academy. So leverage that network, use that network. I have yet to know someone that turned me away because I said, hey, I'm also a fellow grad and I have some questions or some advice that I'd like. So use the network. The second one that I would say is, you have the opportunity to forge your own path. Gone are the days of you've got to hit this set milestone at this set time to do this set thing to go on this path. And it's scary. I feel like sometimes people feel like, well, then when I get out of the Army, I've got to go to grad school, and then I have to do this, and then I have to do that. Maybe, if that's what you want to do. So I think for folks who are thinking about getting out of the Army, or when you get out, just take some opportunities to step back and reflect on who you are, what you want to be, and then think about the path that you want to forge, and then get after it. It's also okay to try a few different things before settling on that one thing. So it's not like you picked your branch and then you're stuck for 5 years. You can try something, you can do something else and do another thing. So I think those are the two pieces that I have for folks, especially those who are saying, hey, I may not make a career out of this. What does that look like? Use your network and take the opportunity to forge that path the way that you want it to be forged.
All amazing points. I'd add on a couple things. I would say, one, doing the small things and doing them right. And so when you're a lieutenant or a cadet, it means being in the right place, right time, right uniform. And that's like 90% of the confidence battle. The next piece I would also say is, don't talk about it, be about it. How often do you run into people where they're talking about the same thing 2 years later, 3 years later? It could be a wild dream, or you could like do the small steps to make it happen. And I think West Point in the military equips you with making those small plans and milestones to make the incredible a real possibility. In my case, it's been more startup than like podcasts and even coming to Google. But in other people, it looks like a variety of different other things. And so you can turn those dreams into reality similar to anything else. And then the last piece, I would say, focus less on the tactics and more on the strategy and thought process. I could tell you how to like write an op-ord. I could tell you how to write a resume. But the question is, like Kafi said earlier, why are you doing it and where are you trying to go? And so doing that soul searching. And it is a scary and a lot of like listening to yourself and talking to people that know you to figure out what that looks like for you. And so on that note, I really appreciate my guests here today. They've given some great wisdom and perspective from civil rights in Vietnam to Women's Army Rugby and the War on Terror. And so I thank my guests for their time and their wisdom.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
This has been a production of the WPAOG Broadcast Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show and join us each week for a new episode. Thank you for listening.